Welcome to the deep dive. We are incredibly glad you're here with us today.
Yeah, really excited to get into this one.
Now, today's deep dive is specially tailored for you, especially if you are a listener who is already, deeply plugged into men's rights advocacy.
Right. And red-pilled manosphere spaces.
Exactly. And the broader conversation around understanding the history of our institutions before they were captured by modern ideological movements.
Because we know you follow these topics closely, and you already understand the baseline vocabulary of these spaces, so we are bypassing the basic definitions today.
We are wading straight into the deep end.
Straight in.
We are looking at a highly requested, incredibly controversial, and frankly explosive new ebook. It is titled Stolen Attention, New Economy of Social Networks, and it's written by Conrad Reicher.
It certainly is a text that pulls absolutely no punches.
No, it doesn't.
I mean, it takes concepts that are often discussed in fragmented ways online and attempts to unify them into a single, overarching grand theory of modern societal decline.
Exactly. But before we get into the weeds of that grand theory, we have a quick favor to ask you.
Just a quick one.
Please make sure to like and subscribe to the show right now so you never miss a deep dive. And if you want to read the full unabridged text of what we are dissecting today,
Which we highly recommend you do.
we highly encourage you to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book. And make sure to follow the author at Conrad Reicher at Substack. That's at ConradNRIKER.
Okay, let's unpack this. What are we actually looking at here?
Well, before we take another step,
Oh, right, the disclaimer.
yes, we need to make something crystal clear regarding the nature of this text. As a crucial impartiality disclaimer, this book contains highly politically charged content
Very charged.
regarding feminism, Marxism, and the structural foundations of modern society.
It is imperative that you, the listener, understand that neither of us here at the Deep Dive is taking a side.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing any of the viewpoints presented in this book, whether they are perceived as left-wing or right-wing.
Our sole mission today is to impartially report on the content provided in our source material.
We are here to objectively convey the original ideas, arguments, and philosophies contained in Conrad Reicher's work.
We are just the messengers. We are mapping out his worldview for you to examine and analyze for yourself.
That is exactly right. We are your guides through the material, nothing more. We are looking at the architecture of his argument.
So, what is the core premise of stolen attention? Reicher basically argues that modern smartphone addiction, the endless scrolling, the notifications,
The entire attention economy.
right. He says these are not accidental byproducts of a few tech companies trying to sell advertisements.
According to the book, they are deliberate. They are engineered tools utilized by cultural Marxists and modern feminists.
The book claims the ultimate goal of these digital tools is to systematically emasculate men, to destroy traditional patriarchal institutions.
And to steal what he calls masculine sovereignty.
It's a massive sweeping claim. He links Silicon Valley algorithms directly to a shadow ideological warfare.
And he begins building that case by looking closely at the mechanics of the tech itself. Specifically, how Silicon Valley engineered social media to exploit male psychology.
Reicher doesn't just say phones are distracting, he says they are weaponized.
He points directly to B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning.
Right, Skinner.
Now, Skinner was the behavioral psychologist in the 1930s who became famous for his experiments with pigeons and rats.
Putting them in boxes with a lever or a button.
Exactly. What Skinner found was that if the animal pressed the button and got a food pellet every single time, they would only press it when they were hungry.
Which makes sense.
But if the reward was unpredictable, if they pressed it and sometimes got food, sometimes got nothing, and sometimes got a massive jackpot of food, the animals would become completely obsessed.
They would pick that button until they collapsed from exhaustion.
This is the concept of intermittent variable rewards. Reicher argues that tech platforms have turned our phones into highly sophisticated digital Skinner boxes.
When you think about the pull to refresh mechanism on a timeline, it is literally the exact physical motion of pulling a slot machine lever.
It really is.
You pull it down, there is a slight pause engineered into the software to build anticipation, and then boom, you either get the jackpot of a viral notification or you get nothing.
The book brings up former Google design ethicist Tristan Harris to cement this point.
Harris actually testified to Congress about this very thing, didn't he?
He did. He called it brain hacking. He explicitly stated to lawmakers that these algorithms were deliberately, consciously modeled on Las Vegas slot machines.
No.
Riker uses this testimony to argue that your phone isn't a communication device. It is a neurochemical casino designed to keep you at the table until your pockets are empty.
And the author backs this up with specific physiological data points. He cites Stanford brain scans from 2017.
The fMRI scans.
Yeah. These scans show that when a person uses social media and receives engagement, it triggers the exact same dopamine pathways in the basal ganglia that light up in gambling addicts hitting a jackpot.
The intermittent nature of the rewards creates neurochemical cravings that are significantly stronger and harder to break than predictable rewards.
And the sheer volume of this interaction is what Riker finds so alarming. The book highlights the statistic that the average person touches, taps, or swipes their phone 2,617 times a single day.
2,617 times.
Hearing that number really reframes how you look at a room full of people just staring at their glowing screens.
If you are touching a device over 2,000 times a day, you are never experiencing 15 minutes of unbroken silent thought.
Never. And Riker points out the brutal financial math behind this constant harvesting. He cites 2022 SEC filings claiming that Meta makes 0.0023 every 38 seconds per user.
Now that sounds like a fraction of a penny.
It does.
But when you multiply that by 3 billion users day in and day out, you see why your attention is being strip-mined. It's an extraction economy.
But Riker argues the cost isn't just financial. It's deeply personal and destructive to men.
He shares some harrowing anecdotes to illustrate that human cost. He details the story of a young kid in Dayton, Ohio.
This was tough to read.
This young man was up at 2 a.m., bathing in blue light, doom scrolling through his feed. The algorithms, which are designed to detect behavioral vulnerabilities in moments of low impulse control, started serving him highly targeted ads.
Forget cash now schemes.
Exactly, because his prefrontal cortex was exhausted and his dopamine system was hijacked. He ended up racking up $18,000 in predatory microloans in a single night.
That is terrifying. It's like the algorithm found a crack in his armor and just poured leverage into it.
It did.
But it doesn't just happen to vulnerable kids. Riker also mentions a high-level executive, a man who literally blew a six-figure salary and lost his career because he couldn't stop checking Twitter during critical board meetings.
The artificial neurochemical compulsion completely overrode his biological survival instincts.
He knew checking his phone would get him fired. He knew it would destroy his livelihood. But the digital Skinner box was too strong.
And this is the crux of Riker's argument in this early part of the book. It leads into what he terms the strategic emasculation theory.
If you assume that these platforms are extracting wealth and attention, the next question is, what is the cultural effect of a population of men who cannot focus?
Riker posits that destroying male focus is a deliberate tactic to make men docile and compliant.
He cites a UC Berkeley study showing that the average modern office worker is interrupted every 3 minutes.
And the study notes it takes roughly 23 minutes for the human brain to regain a state of deep flow state focus after an interruption.
Which means, mathematically, if you are interrupted every 3 minutes, you literally never reach deep focus at all during a standard workday.
You are perpetually operating in a state of shallow, reactive cognition.
And Riker connects this constant fragmentation of attention directly to what he views as leftist corporate culture. He argues that modern human resources departments and corporate structures actively weaponize this distraction.
He makes a specific, highly controversial claim about Boeing engineers. Riker argues that these engineers, responsible for complex aerospace mathematics, couldn't go 5 minutes without being interrupted by mandatory diversity training pop-ups or Slack notifications from HR.
He argues this contributed to a loss of the solitary concentration that is absolutely essential to masculine mastery and engineering excellence, which he claims ultimately led to catastrophic systemic failures.
It's a highly provocative synthesis. The author is suggesting that the entire modern corporate environment, the open floor plans where anyone can tap you on the shoulder,
The constant push notifications.
the endless bureaucratic HR mandates. He says they are all part of an invisible architecture, an architecture designed to deliberately scatter male attention.
He writes that men are being treated like indentured labor in a modern encomienda system run by tech oligarchs.
The broader implication here, which sets up the rest of his book, is that the destruction of focus isn't just about selling advertisements or maximizing quarterly profits. It sets the stage for a much larger ideological takeover.
Riker's thesis is that a distracted man, a man who cannot hold a single thought in his head for 20 minutes without checking a screen, cannot possibly defend his intellectual, cultural, or familial territory.
That is a massive leap to make. but it forms the bridge to his next major argument.
If Silicon Valley algorithms are busy stealing male attention and keeping men in a state of reactive distraction, as Riker claims, the next logical question is, what are ideological opponents doing with the culture while the men are distracted?
According to the book, they are rewriting the very code of human interaction.
Riker argues that the Frankfurt School and modern leftists have systematically weaponized language to pathologize natural male behavior.
If your attention is stolen, you can't guard the gates of your culture's language.
This linguistic warfare is a cornerstone of the book's thesis. Riker places a heavy, almost obsessive emphasis on etymology.
Specifically tracing Latin and Greek roots to demonstrate how meanings have been carefully and deliberately inverted over the last century.
For instance, he spends considerable time on the Latin word virgus.
Historically, in the time of the Roman Republic, as used by statesmen like Cicero, virtus did not mean being a nice, polite person.
No.
It meant manly courage, martial excellence, and physical grit. It was the specific virtue displayed by the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, holding the pass against an overwhelming force.
He also looks at the Latin word pater, meaning father, protector, and provider. This is the root from which we get the word patriarchy.
Right.
Riker argues that feminists and cultural Marxists have essentially hacked the societal lexicon. They've taken these terms, which historically denoted sacrifice, protection, and excellence, and inverted them to mean oppression, tyranny, and servitude.
He says the language hackers have convinced society that the instinct to protect is actually an instinct to control.
And a central example he uses for this linguistic hijacking is the toxic masculinity trap.
Now, most listeners are intimately familiar with how that phrase is used today, but Riker points out its surprising origins.
The term was actually coined by a man named Shepard Bliss in the 1980s and 90s.
Bliss was a leader in the mythopoetic men's movement. When Bliss coined toxic masculinity, he was actually using it to describe the emotional suppression and corporatization of men.
He was arguing for men to reconnect with their deep, primal, agrarian roots.
But Riker claims that by around 2005, modern intersectional feminists completely hijacked Bliss's term. They weaponized it to essentially criminalize natural male protective and competitive instincts.
Suddenly, according to Riker, if a boy shows aggression on a playground, or a father exhibits a fierce instinct to guard his family, or a man demonstrates extreme competitiveness in the workplace, it isn't seen as a misapplied virtue.
It is labeled as systemic pathology. It's treated as a disease that needs to be medicated or educated out of him.
Which raises an important question. How exactly did this massive linguistic and cultural shift occur on a societal level without massive pushback?
How did this inversion become the dominant narrative in academia and media?
Riker traces the root of this back to the philosopher Herbert Marcuse, a prominent member of the Frankfurt School.
Specifically, Riker points to Marcuse's 1965 essay titled Repressive Tolerance.
The book argues that this single document birthed the philosophical framework for modern cancel culture.
I found this part of the book particularly dense. How exactly does Riker connect a 1965 philosophical essay to the modern phenomenon of getting canceled on Twitter or fired for a joke?
It requires understanding Marcuse's twisted logic, which Riker attempts to dissect. Marcuse argued in Repressive Tolerance that true objective tolerance in a society actually empowers the oppressive establishment.
Therefore, Marcuse proposed a paradoxical solution. For a society to be truly liberated, it must practice what he called liberating tolerance.
And this meant showing absolute tolerance for all ideas coming from the political left and absolute rigid intolerance for any ideas coming from the political right.
Marcuse argued that conservative, traditional, or patriarchal ideas were inherently violent, and therefore shutting them down, silencing them, or using institutional force against them wasn't censorship, it was self-defense.
Riker argues this 1965 framework is the exact operating system of modern HR departments, university administrations, and tech censorship boards.
It's the mandate to silence dissenting conservative voices under the guise of preventing harm.
Riker claims this philosophy has been so thoroughly institutionalized in our educational systems that it has created an entire generation of what he calls NPC zombies on college campuses.
He uses the video game term non-player characters to describe activists who mindlessly chant ideological slogans without possessing any actual understanding of the philosophy they are weaponizing.
To prove this point, he cites a highly revealing anecdote. Riker points to a 2021 study conducted by researchers at UC Berkeley.
These researchers went out into the field during major anti-capitalist protests on campus and surveyed the most vocal student activists.
They asked some basic definitional questions about what they were protesting.
The study found that 73% of these activists completely failed to define the word neoliberalism.
Which was the very core concept they were screaming through megaphones to dismantle.
That is wild. They couldn't even define the word written on their own protest signs.
Riker uses this to argue that these students aren't independent, critical thinkers forming a grassroots movement. He argues they are essentially blank slates that have been infected with what he calls verbal malware.
They are engineered by ideological saboteurs in the faculty lounges to disrupt society, much like a botnet is used to DDoS a website.
Furthermore, the book delves into what Riker terms historical erasure. He argues that to control the future of gender dynamics, ideological movements must first falsify the past.
He launches a massive critique against Friedrich Engels' 1884 text, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State.
Engels, co-author of the Communist Manifesto, argued that the traditional patriarchal family was essentially a capitalist invention designed solely for property exchange.
And that prior to capitalism, humans lived in peaceful, egalitarian matriarchies.
And Riker claims that modern intersectional feminists use Engels' unproven 19th century theories to push the myth of prehistoric matriarchies today in gender studies classes.
To counter this, Riker completely bypasses modern sociology and goes straight to ancient archaeological evidence.
He specifically brings up the Bronze Age Nusi tablets. These are thousands of cuneiform texts excavated in Mesopotamia.
Riker says these tablets prove that ancient, deeply patriarchal societies were not the oppressive prisons feminists claim them to be.
The Nusi tablets, he argues, show that within these ancient patriarchal frameworks, women actually had robust protected rights.
They owned land, they ran complex mercantile businesses, and they had legal standing in courts.
Riker argues that true oppression of women's economic agency was largely a product of much later 19th century English common law, not the ancient inherent structure of patriarchy itself.
The author is essentially claiming that the historical narrative has been intentionally inverted.
So, if we connect this to the bigger picture, what does all this etymology, philosophy, and ancient history mean for you, the listener, navigating the world today?
According to Riker, this linguistic warfare and historical revisionism aren't just academic debates. They directly and physically impact the real world, specifically in how society views, regulates, and legislates male and female biology today.
If the words we use dictate the reality we are allowed to perceive, then hacking the language allows you to hack human nature itself.
That transition brings us perfectly into the next major pillar of his argument, which focuses on biological determinism versus what Riker calls the gender heresy.
Having argued that our attention is stolen and our language is hijacked, Riker now attempts to plant his flag in the bedrock of human evolution.
His core concept in this section is that gender roles, the distinct behavioral patterns of men and women, are not arbitrary social constructs cooked up by old men in a room to oppress people.
Rather, he argues they are divinely and biologically mandated imperatives that cannot be dismantled without destroying the species.
To make this case, Riker relies heavily on the field of evolutionary psychology. Now, listeners to the show are likely very familiar with the concept of hypergamy.
But Riker doesn't just use it as an internet buzzword. He anchors it in peer-reviewed science.
He leans heavily on the evolutionary psychologist David Buss, specifically citing Buss's massive landmark 37 culture study detailed in his book, The Evolution of Desire.
Buss surveyed thousands of people across vastly different cultures, from modern Western cities to rural, developing nations, and found a universal constant.
And that constant is female hypergamy. The biological, hardwired instinct for women to seek mating partners who possess higher resources, higher physical status, and greater capacity to provide security than themselves.
Riker uses Buss's study to argue that hypergamy is not a cultural artifact of capitalism or a bad habit. It is a universal, evolutionary baseline designed to ensure the survival of offspring.
And to prove that this evolutionary drive is playing out in devastating ways right now, today, Riker details incredibly stark Tinder statistics provided in the text.
The statistics he cites paint a grim picture for the average man.
He notes that data gleaned from dating app algorithms reveals that women swipe right, indicating interest on only the top 10 to 20% of men based on physical appearance and perceived status.
Riker describes this dynamic as creating vast attention deserts for the average and below average man.
He argues that dating apps haven't just modernized romance, they have weaponized this biological hypergamy.
They have created an unchecked, hyper-efficient digital coliseum. Because modern feminism has spent the last 50 years systematically dismantling traditional monogamous courtship guardrails.
Things like community matchmaking, strong social stigmas against infidelity, and the expectation of long-term commitment.
He argues they have unleashed raw, unregulated hypergamy onto the market.
This leaves the vast majority of men entirely starved for intimacy and connection, while a tiny, elite fraction of men at the top hoard all the attention.
It creates a wildly unstable societal dynamic, but the author argues the trap doesn't end there.
He says that when average men do manage to navigate this digital coliseum, find a partner, and enter into the legal contract of marriage, they are stepping into an even more dangerous snare.
Riker calls this the gynocratic system. The book takes an exceptionally harsh, critical view of modern family courts and domestic jurisprudence.
He begins by tracing the history of modern no-fault divorce.
Right, which most people don't realize only kicked off in California around 1970, signed into law by then-Governor Ronald Reagan.
Before that, you had to prove a specific fault like adultery or abuse to dissolve the legal contract of marriage.
Riker claims that the introduction of no-fault divorce was essentially the beginning of a legalized heist against male resources.
He cites statistics claiming that in contested situations, mothers win between 85 to 92% of physical custody battles.
He argues the family court system routinely liquidates a man's assets, separates him from his children, and turns fathers into what he bluntly calls walking ATMs.
The author goes further, arguing that the entire legal apparatus inherently assumes male guilt by default. A prime target of his critique is the Duluth model.
For context, the Duluth model was a framework developed in Duluth, Minnesota in the early 1980s to address domestic violence. It became the most widely adopted model for law enforcement and courts in the United States.
Riker claims that the Duluth model is fundamentally flawed because it is built on radical feminist theory rather than empirical sociology.
He argues it explicitly trains law enforcement officers to view all domestic disputes solely through the lens of male patriarchal entitlement and female victimhood.
According to Riker, this model intentionally ignores massive bodies of data showing reciprocal violence or female-initiated violence in domestic disputes,
Ensuring that the man is almost always the one removed from the home in handcuffs, regardless of the context.
And Riker then transitions from family court into the broader concept of false accusations as a formalized tactic of asymmetrical warfare.
He argues that movements like Believe Women have actively and intentionally destroyed the presumption of innocence and constitutional due process.
To illustrate this, the examples he gives are intense and highly publicized. He mentions the Brian Banks case.
Banks was a massively promising high school football player with NFL prospects who spent 5 years in prison for rape, only to be fully exonerated when his accuser was caught on tape, admitting she completely fabricated the story to protect herself from getting in trouble with her mother.
He also brings up the infamous Duke lacrosse hoax of 2006, where an entire team of young men were aggressively vilified by the national media, the local prosecutor, and their own university faculty for months before DNA evidence and shifting stories definitively proved the accusations were false.
Riker points to these high-profile cases not as anomalies, but as visible symptoms of a much larger systemic issue.
He asserts that a staggering 87% of Title IX accusations on college campuses today completely bypass standard constitutional evidentiary due process.
He views this entire apparatus not as a pursuit of justice, but as an industrial payoff matrix, where male reputations, careers, and freedom are routinely sacrificed on the altar of ideological expediency.
To ground these massive societal and legal observations back in the physical realm, Riker returns to the raw biology of hormones.
He draws a stark contrast between testosterone on one side and oxytocin and cortisol on the other.
He writes about testosterone in almost mystical terms, describing it as sacramental oil for warriors.
He argues that testosterone is what fuels the competitiveness, risk-taking, and physical resilience required to build and defend civilizations.
Conversely, he looks at oxytocin, often referred to as the cuddle hormone, which plays a massive role in female bonding, childbirth, and maternal instinct.
Interestingly, Riker notes that in men, oxytocin functions differently. It is often released as a bonding mechanism after competitive victories alongside other men, reinforcing tribal cohesion among warriors.
Furthermore, he argues that men are uniquely, biologically equipped to metabolize chaos and stress.
He cites endocrinological studies showing how male cortisol levels, the stress hormone, drop significantly faster than female cortisol levels in high-stress, combat-like scenarios, allowing men to maintain lethal focus when society depends on it.
And he uses this very specific biological argument to launch a scathing critique of modern military policies.
Riker cites a comprehensive 2022 review of Israel's 2017 initiative to integrate women into frontline co-ed combat battalions.
According to the data Riker presents in the book, integrating women into these elite infantry units resulted in a staggering 65% more casualties compared to traditional all-male units.
The author's point here is brutal and direct. Ignoring hard biological realities regarding bone density, fast-twitch muscle fiber, and hormonal stress responses just to appease modern political correctness literally gets men killed on the battlefield.
It is a very stark, unforgiving claim. Riker is essentially arguing that you cannot legislate away biology.
When a society denies the biological realities and what he views as the divine code of the sexes, it doesn't just create awkward social dynamics. It invites its own literal physical destruction.
This transitions us perfectly into his next major theme. If society is ignoring these realities, what is the inevitable result?
This brings us to section 4 of his argument, the fall of empires, looking at the trajectory from ancient Rome to modern Detroit.
The core concept here is that Riker draws direct, explicit historical parallels between ancient civilizational collapse and modern societal decay.
He argues that abandoning the patriarchal order is not a sign of progressive enlightenment, but rather the root cause of the death of empires.
Let's look at the Roman parallel he uses, which I found fascinating. He goes back to 195 BCE and cites the statesman Cato the Elder and the events surrounding the Oppian Law.
To provide some necessary historical context for the listener, 195 BCE was a volatile time. The Second Punic War against Hannibal had recently ended. Rome was economically devastated.
Decades earlier, to fund the war effort, Rome passed the Oppian Law, which severely restricted female ownership of luxury goods, expensive jewelry, and colorful garments, redirecting wealth to the state's survival.
However, 20 years after the war ended, Roman women flooded the streets, blocking the doors of the tribunes, aggressively protesting and demanding the repeal of this austerity law so they could reclaim their luxuries.
And Cato the Elder gave a famous, blistering speech against repealing the law.
Cato warned the Roman Senate that surrendering to these protests, yielding to the demands for luxury, would permanently subvert the authority of husbands and unleash what he termed female tyranny over the state.
Riker uses this ancient political battle as a direct metaphor. He argues that the Roman Empire ultimately began its long, slow decline the moment it surrendered to what he characterizes as feminine hysteria.
He explicitly compares those ancient demands for colorful silks and gold to the modern demands for expansive alimony, no-fault divorce settlements, and the massive state-funded welfare systems that he claims disproportionately drain male resources and labor today.
The author then broadens his scope, contrasting the historical success of patriarchal systems with what he views as the inherent failure of matriarchal societies.
A prime target of his critique is the Musuo tribe in southwestern China.
Now, the Musuo are frequently, almost romantically, cited by modern Western anthropologists as a beautifully functioning, peaceful matrilineal society where women control the wealth and lineage.
Riker, however, looks at the dark underbelly of that same data. He claims that modern studies of the Musuo reveal a society in deep crisis.
According to the book, this matriarchal tribe suffers from an astonishing 40% male suicide rate, rampant male depression, and triple the rates of juvenile delinquency compared to neighboring traditional patriarchal Han Chinese regions.
He connects the plight of the Musuo directly to the crisis in the modern West. Riker cites a chilling Department of Justice statistic. 80% of juvenile murderers and the vast majority of prison inmates in the United States come from father-absent homes.
For Riker, fatherlessness isn't just a sad sociological byproduct of progressive policies, it is active civilizational suicide.
He paints a very bleak picture of Detroit, Michigan, using its empty, rusting factories and profound urban decay as the ultimate tragic monument to this ideology.
He argues Detroit fell not just because of globalization, but because the foundational role of the male provider was systematically replaced by state welfare checks and bloated union bureaucracy.
When the fathers left the home because the state subsidized their absence, the city collapsed.
To provide a philosophical and almost cosmological framework for these sweeping historical claims, Riker introduces a highly complex theory, Chris Lankin's cognitive theoretic model of the universe, often abbreviated as the CTMU.
When I was reading the section on the CTMU, it struck me how Riker is essentially trying to prove that traditional gender roles aren't just good cultural habits, but literally the laws of physics.
But it's a very dense concept. For listeners who might not know Chris Langan or this theory, how exactly does Riker use the CTMU here?
It requires a bit of unpacking. Chris Langan is known for having one of the highest recorded IQs in the world, famously working as a bar bouncer while developing this profound theory of reality.
A Langan CTMU essentially posits that reality is not just dead matter randomly interacting. Rather, the universe functions as a self-configuring language, a kind of conscious divine syntax that is constantly calculating itself.
Riker takes Langan's highly abstract metaphysical model and maps it directly onto biblical theology, specifically Genesis 1.28, the command given to man to subdue the earth and exercise dominion over it.
So he is merging high-level quantum metaphysics with Old Testament theology.
Precisely. The author argues that this male drive for dominion, the instinct to impose logic, structure, and order onto chaotic nature, is not a toxic patriarchal construct.
According to Riker, it is the universe's literal source code. It is how reality progresses.
Therefore, according to Riker's logic, denying this natural hierarchy, or attempting to dismantle it through modern gender ideology, feminism, or the disruption of male focus by tech algorithms is not merely a political disagreement.
Riker categorizes it as an Ahrimanic deception.
That's a very specific term. Ahrimanic referring to Ahriman, the destructive, deceiving spirit in ancient Zoroastrianism.
Yes. Or what he alternatively calls a Gnostic heresy, the ancient belief that the material, created order of the world is inherently evil and must be escaped or destroyed.
Riker is arguing that the modern feminist and Marxist project is a literal rebellion against the very syntax and structure of reality itself.
Okay, let's take a breath and synthesize where we are, because the stakes he is laying out are astronomical.
If the modern digital world and our cultural institutions are engineered traps designed to extract male wealth and attention,
If language has been hijacked to criminalize male virtue,
if the legal system is a rigged coliseum,
and if society is collapsing like Rome because we are actively rebelling against the divine source code of the universe.
what on earth is a man supposed to do? What is the author's blueprint for escaping this matrix?
That urgent question brings us to the final and perhaps most practical major section of the book, the antidote.
Having diagnosed the disease, Riker outlines his actionable protocols for men to reclaim their lost sovereignty.
The core concept uniting all these protocols is a radical return to extreme discipline, intentional physical suffering, and sharp, uncompromising logic.
It is a synthesis of ancient Stoicism, religious asceticism, and modern red pill philosophy.
Riker starts this protocol with the mind, with what he calls monastic focus. He looks far back in history, specifically to the Trappist monks and the 4th century Egyptian desert fathers, figures like Evagrius Ponticus.
Now, these ancient monks were hardcore. They were logging 72-hour prayer marathons alone in the blazing desert.
Riker discusses their guiding philosophical concept, a Greek term called nepsis. Nepsis translates roughly to a state of vigilant sobriety of the soul.
But Riker emphasizes that this is not the passive, gentle mindfulness you see promoted by modern wellness influencers or corporate yoga retreats.
Nepsis is active, violent thought combat. It is the practice of standing guard at the gates of your own mind and ruthlessly striking down any distracting or impure thought the moment it arises.
And he doesn't just rely on ancient theology to prove this works. He backs it up with modern neuroscience.
Riker cites fMRI brain scans showing that monks who practice this specific kind of intense, focused, hesychase prayer actually undergo radical neuroplastic changes.
The scans reveal that these monks develop prefrontal cortexes, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, focus, and long-term planning, that are up to 300% thicker than the average modern humans.
To make this accessible, Riker distills this ancient asceticism into what he calls the Harvard Protocol.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that protocol because it sounds incredibly difficult in the modern age. It's essentially a 12-minute daily practice.
You take a sacred or deeply philosophical text, you read it, you meditate on its core truth, you pray or journal about it, and then here's the hardest part, you sit in absolute silent contemplation.
No music, no phone, no pacing, just silence. Think about how difficult that is today. Compare the pure agony of sitting in a quiet room for 12 minutes to the modern anxiety you feel when you're just waiting 2 minutes for someone to text you back.
We are so wired for constant input that 12 minutes of silence feels like sensory deprivation. But Riker argues this pain is necessary to build attentional resilience.
From the mind, he moves to the concept of enduring failure, outlining the persistence protocol. He talks about Thomas Edison.
We all know the story of Edison failing 10,000 times before inventing the light bulb. But Riker reframes this not just as an inspirational poster, but as the ultimate masculine alchemy, the ability to process agonizing loss and instantly convert it into leverage.
To systematically build this unnatural level of persistence, he recommends highly specific, often harsh physical and mental practices.
He draws a lot of inspiration from modern endurance athletes here. He mentions David Goggins' famous cookie jar technique.
The mechanics of this are fascinating. When you are at your absolute breaking point, when your brain is screaming at you to quit, you mentally reach into a cookie jar of your past victories, moments where you overcame impossible odds, and you use that memory as fuel to push through the current pain.
He also heavily advocates for daily cold plunges, plunging the body into freezing water.
The goal isn't just physical recovery. It's to intentionally spike your cortisol and adrenaline levels in a controlled environment, training your brain to remain perfectly calm and deliberate while your body is in a state of sheer panic.
He even ventures into extreme financial discipline, suggesting readers adopt what he calls John D. Rockefeller's poverty simulation.
Riker challenges men to voluntarily live on just 10% of their income for 1 week every single month.
The psychological goal here is to intentionally harden the mind against the fear of financial ruin, to realize how little you actually need to survive, and thereby expand your survival threshold.
These are all calculated methods of voluntary suffering, designed to inoculate men against the pervasive, numbing softness of modern life.
And the protocols get even more physically intense from there. Riker outlines David's Goliath training regimen.
He points out that the biblical King David is often depicted just playing a harp, but Riker reminds the reader that David was a physically lethal warrior who literally killed lions and bears with his bare hands before he ever faced Goliath.
Riker writes, memorably, that muscles are God's anti-tank rounds.
He points to the historical training of the Spartan Gauche and the brutal daily life of the Roman legionnaires. He notes that these conquering forces ate a heavily carnivorous diet, consuming upwards of a pound of meat a day to fuel their relentless physical output.
For Riker, a man cannot possess true moral virtue if he lacks the functional physical strength to enforce it. Weakness is not a virtue.
But physical strength and mental focus are only half the battle. Once the mind and body are hardened into weapons, Riker addresses how men must fight back intellectually in the public square in a chapter he titles Speech Combat.
He advocates for a rigorous mastery of the trivium. Now, the trivium is the classical medieval foundation of education, consisting of grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
By mastering these three tools of thought, he argues men can methodically deconstruct modern feminist syllogisms and expose their underlying logical fallacies.
It's essentially a blueprint for intellectual dismantling. Let's look at a practical example of how Riker suggests using this.
First is grammar. This means forcing your opponent to rigidly define the terms they're using, like demanding they define neoliberalism or equity. You don't let them hide behind vague buzzwords.
Second is logic. This involves analyzing the structure of your argument to find the contradiction, like pointing out that you cannot simultaneously claim that gender is a social construct while also claiming that brain chemistry is inherently male or female.
And finally, rhetoric, delivering the counterpunch with persuasive, undeniable force.
The historical example he gives for this is the Apostle Paul at Mars Hill in ancient Athens.
When Paul spoke to the Athenians, he didn't just stand there and preach foreign concepts at them. He brilliantly utilized rhetoric.
He quoted their own Stoic philosophers, referenced their own altars to an unknown god, and used their own deeply held logic against them to systematically dismantle their pagan worldview from the inside out.
Riker tells his readers they must do the exact same thing. You must master the enemy's logic so thoroughly that you can use it to expose their fatal contradictions.
Finally, the book moves into the most radical separatist phase of the antidote. It touches heavily on MGTOW, the men going their own way movement, and what Riker calls biblical economics.
Now you, our listener, are likely already very familiar with MGTOW and the general philosophy of walking away from a system that is rigged against you. But Riker takes this a step further.
As a defense mechanism against a system he views as fundamentally predatory toward male resources, the author advises drastic, permanent measures.
He discusses the necessity of men legally protecting their assets from family courts, advocating for strictly avoiding all state-sanctioned marriage contracts.
He even discusses the growing trend of men freezing their sperm to prevent any possibility of what he terms reproductive coercion or entrapment.
But he doesn't just advocate for isolation. He advocates for parallel construction. Riker details the concept of building parallel, exclusively male-centric institutions and microeconomies.
He actually mentions a theoretical and perhaps emerging concept he calls St. Bachelor'sburg.
This isn't just about men living alone in the woods. It's a vision of an intentional enclave where men pool their capital, create their own supply chains, protect their wealth from gynocentric taxation and redistribution, and live strictly by their own patriarchal rules.
For Riker, retreating into these enclaves isn't an act of cowardly surrender, it is a tactical withdrawal.
It is the strategy of deliberately starving a corrupt, collapsing system of the male capital, labor, and attention it desperately needs to survive.
It is, without a doubt, a comprehensive, radical, and highly controversial blueprint for severing all ties with mainstream societal expectations and forging a highly disciplined, completely insulated counterculture.
So bringing all of these massive disparate threads together to synthesize this deep dive, the book Stolen Attention, New Economy of Social Networks by Conrad Riker makes the audacious argument that modern digital platforms are not just addictive toys.
They are meticulously engineered weapons of cultural Marxism, designed to distract men from their biological and divine patriarchal purpose.
To break free from this digital and cultural matrix, Riker offers a strict, almost brutal regimen of stoic mental conditioning, extreme physical hardening, and absolute digital discipline.
And as we close, we must provide our final impartiality reminder. It is vital to state once again that these highly polarizing arguments, these sweeping historical interpretations, and these severe societal critiques belong entirely and exclusively to the author, Conrad Riker.
We, the hosts of this deep dive, have simply provided an objective, detailed map of his worldview. We are not taking a political side, nor are we endorsing these views as truth.
Our goal was strictly to unpack and illuminate the text for you, the listener, so you can evaluate the arguments for yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on this extensive journey through a very challenging text. Please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the deep dive right now so we can keep bringing you these in-depth, uncompromising breakdowns of the most important texts out there.
And again, if you want to dive into the source material yourself and read the full arguments we discussed today, be sure to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book, and absolutely follow the author at Conrad Riker at Substack for his ongoing essays and updates.
To leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own as you go about your day, the author points out that ancient scribes and desert monks built mental fortresses of focus that allowed them to outproduce modern executives by orders of magnitude, possessing a clarity of mind we can barely comprehend today.
If the very architecture of our modern digital world is, as Riker argues, inherently engineered to fragment your attention and extract your vital energy.
Is it actually possible to truly build a lasting generational legacy today without completely, entirely disconnecting from the modern grid? Can you truly be in the matrix without eventually being of it?
A phenomenal question to end on.
Thanks for listening, and we will see you on the next deep dive.